Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the May 2021 edition of Socialism for All. And in light of what is going on in Palestine right now, heavy attacks from Israel into Palestine, Haymarket Books, a radical book publisher, has made available for free a 2020 collection called Palestine, A Socialist Introduction, edited by Sumaya, Awad, and Brian Bean. If you want, you can go to the Haymarket Books website and pick this up for free. I will put a link in the video description to that. And here on the channel, I'm going to read several of the pieces from this collection. There are, I believe, 10 in the collection. I'm going to read 2 or 3 of them on the channel, but do go pick that up again. It's free. So in this file, I'm going to read the first chapter or article in the collection. It's called Roots of the Nakba, Zionist Settler Colonialism. It's by Sumaya Awad and Annie Levin. Let's get into the text. Palestine before 1948. Olive groves stretching across rolling hills, dotting the land between mountains and the Mediterranean Sea. Orange groves, too, sprinkled by the hundreds around Jerusalem and Jaffa, weaving through smaller villages and towns, where agriculture kept entire Palestinian communities economically self-sufficient. Cinemas and theaters featuring new entertainment that rocked the world at the time. Cafes and bakeries where Palestinians and people in transit from across the region filtered through on a daily basis on their way to school, a meeting, or a doctor's appointment with some of the finest physicians in the region. Each Palestinian city and town had an identity, a rich history and tradition, perhaps best reflected in unique tatriz patterns, or embroidery stitches attributed to different regions. Traditions of 3 different faiths existed side by side. A railway system connected Jerusalem to Damascus and Haifa to smaller towns and villages on the Palestinian coast, where workers traveled in droves to fill factories at the turn of the 20th century. A vibrant trade port in Haifa welcomed ships crossing the Mediterranean with supplies and sent them off laden with produce and other goods. To the south, Palestine served as a direct route to North Africa, where, in the decades to come, revolutionaries would begin their struggle for independence from British, French, Spanish, and Italian colonizers. It's easy to romanticize what existed before Israel was established, and before systematic ethnic cleansing campaigns were organized to erase any semblance of Palestinian history, culture, and identity. What is today the Levant was not yet spliced into separate countries with outlined borders. That would come later, with pacts made by European imperialists staking their claims on the Middle East, mainly through the Balfour Declaration and Sykes-Picot Agreement. Prior to these, borders differentiating Syria from Lebanon and the east and west banks of the Jordan River were porous, though not entirely ineffectual. Still, one thing is abundantly clear from historical accounts of Palestine before 1948. Palestinians existed. They thrived politically, culturally, and socially. And, like others across the global south, they were immersed in a sustained struggle for independence. What is the Nakba, and how must we talk about it? The Nakba refers to the ethnic cleansing of Palestine in 1948, when, over a period of several months, Jewish militia groups known as the Irgun and Haganah conducted raids, massacres, and depopulation campaigns across Palestine, all under orders from Zionist leadership, which aimed to drive Palestinians out en masse. The Irgun and Haganah would later form the basis for Israel's military, the Israel Defense Forces. Through the Nakba, Israel established itself as a sovereign state on Palestinian land, and the world's largest refugee population to date was born. In a period characterized by independence and decolonization across the global south, Israel was founded as a settler colonial state on occupied land. In 1947-48, 400 Palestinian villages were completely destroyed, replaced in many cases by illegal settlements, resorts, and parks, all of which Palestinians are barred from entering. The term catastrophe, the literal translation of the word Nakba, cannot do justice to the aftermath of ethnic cleansing. When remembering the Nakba became a punishable crime, Palestinian became synonymous with terrorist, and history was written to erase not just the identity of Palestinians, but their humanity as well. Crucial to the understanding of these events are the 3 decades of colonial expansion in Palestine and the broader Middle East following the First World War. In the early 20th century, as the Yishuv began to grow and the Balfour Declaration of 1917 was signed, legitimizing the Zionist project and its claim to Palestinian land, tensions began to fester. The following years saw the Zionist seizure of indigenous land, and the struggle for Palestine began. The British, after giving Zionist leaders approval and supporting the building of an exclusionary Jewish state, could not mediate a constructive plan or gain the trust of the Palestinians or the Arabs at large, whose lands had been carved up by Britain and other European colonial powers after the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire. In the late 1940s, the United Nations intervened with the 1947 Partition Plan, which divided Palestinian land into areas designated for Jewish settlement and areas for Palestinians, legitimizing the Zionist claim to control over that land. Plan Dalet, commonly referred to as Plan D, was the Haganah's initiative to forcibly take over not only all areas allocated to the Jewish community by the United Nations Resolution of 1947, but also any areas the Yishuv deemed critical to ensure the further expansion of the Jewish state on Palestinian land. The Haganah was divided into brigades, each with the responsibility of occupying a list of villages. Occupation most often entailed complete destruction. Few villages were left intact after Plan D had run its course. This was a deliberate campaign to raze all Palestinian homes, schools, and hospitals to the ground, so there would be nothing left for Palestinians to return to. One of the most notorious of the Haganah militias was the Alexandroni Brigade. This brigade was given a list of 64 villages sprinkled between Upper Haifa down to modern-day Tel Aviv. On this list was the village of Tantura. In the 1940s, the village of Tantura was a Palestinian coastal community on the shores of the Mediterranean. Its proximity to the sea tied the village's economy to trade and commerce with neighboring Lebanon, and railroads integrated the village into the industry and agriculture of nearby Haifa. On May 22, 1948, Tantura joined the approximately 400 other villages to be occupied, depopulated, and destroyed by the Haganah. Teddy Katz, an Israeli student at Haifa University, chose to write about Tantura for his master's thesis in 1998. The conclusion of Katz's project illuminated the mass execution of men, women, and children, predominantly between the ages of 13 and 30, at the hands of the Zionist militia, for no apparent reason other than their presence on land Israel sought to control. Quote, "All of the men of Tantura were taken to the cemetery of the village, and they put them in lines, and they ordered them to begin digging, and every line that finished digging just was shot and fell down to the holes," which I guess reminds at least a few of you something that had to do with Germans 3 years after the end of the Second World War. Unquote. The events in Tantura amounted to the ethnic cleansing of an entire village and the murder of hundreds of innocent civilians. For his findings, Katz was punished by his university and sued by Haganah veterans. In the end, his research was removed from all Haifa University libraries and records. Of course, long before Katz, Palestinian historians have shed light on these atrocities, but their scholarly work has been cast aside, deemed to, quote, subjective, and thus not credible, because rarely does history rely on the oppressed for truth. After Katz's trial, many of the Israeli army archives he had accessed for research were sealed from the public under the pretext of, quote, security. Although Nakba is often translated as catastrophe, truthfully, there's no accurate translation of the word. After all, how does one translate the attempted murder and destruction of an entire people? Whole families, homes, villages, and towns erased, gone. How does one translate massacres like Tantura's, where Palestinian children watched as their fathers were lined up and shot before being thrown in a large pit, a pit the men were forced to dig hours before their death? How do you translate Deir Yassin, where nearly every Palestinian was killed, women raped and then burned in their homes? Or Palestinian villages where Israeli commanders placed a bomb next to every home and then detonated the bombs all at once? Major General Awad recounted the events of the day to Israeli historian Boaz Levtov. Quote, "What happened there? We came, we entered the village, planted a bomb next to every house, and afterward Homesh blew on a trumpet, because we didn't have radios and that was the signal for our forces to leave. We're running in reverse. The sappers stay, they pull, it's all primitive. They light the fuse or pull the detonator, and all those houses are gone." Unquote. Golda Meir, one of the prominent Zionist leaders and architects of the 1948 ethnic cleansing, walked into the city of Haifa only days after Jewish militia raided the city, and within hours expelled its inhabitants under threat of death. She recounted in her journal the horror and destruction she witnessed. In his book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, Ilan Pappé details Meir's reaction. Quote, "She at first found it hard to suppress a feeling of horror when she entered homes where cooked food still stood on the tables. Children had left toys and books on the floor, and life appeared to have frozen in an instant. Meir had come to Palestine from the U.S., where her family had fled in the wake of pogroms in Russia, and the sights she witnessed that day reminded her of the worst stories her family had told her about the Russian brutality against Jews decades earlier." Unquote. 20 years later, Meir became the fourth Prime Minister of Israel. Yigal Allon, a military commander during the 1948 ethnic cleansing and later a general in the Israel Defense Forces, was quoted in an early Israeli leader's diary defending the indiscriminate killing of all Palestinians. Quote, "We need to be accurate about timing, place, and those we hit. If we accurse a family, we need to harm them without mercy, women and children included. Otherwise, this is not an effective reaction. During the operation, there is no need to distinguish between guilty and not guilty." Unquote. Little has changed 7 decades later. In April 2018, Israeli Defense Minister Avigdor Lieberman insisted there are no innocent people in Gaza, after a video surfaced that depicted an Israeli cackling and cheering as he used live ammunition against unarmed Palestinian protesters in the occupied Strip. The case of the village of Tantora and hundreds of others like it are crucial to understanding the importance of remembering and naming the Nakba. Since 1948, Israel has systematically attempted to erase the events of the Nakba and, as such, the very identity of Palestinians. Quick comment, there was a very recent incident, actually, where the Israeli ambassador to Britain, I believe, explicitly went on a whole talk about how the Nakba was an Arab lie, etc. This was met with outrage, but they do still do it. Continuing. This erasure has been aided by Orientalist tropes that deny Palestinian existence, or argue that Palestinians can and should, quote, "blend in with other Arabs in neighboring countries." In order for Israel to establish itself, it needed to erase the identity of the indigenous population. For an identity to be formed, it must be grounded in tradition and a shared notion of historical memory. Israel had succeeded in fabricating both in order to create the Israeli citizen. In order for Israel to establish for itself a new and legitimate national identity, the other, the Palestinian, had to be excluded and its history reformulated, either to fit into the Israeli narrative or to be absorbed by surrounding Arab states. Palestinians have been robbed of the right to narrate their own past. This right to remember is made impossible by the Israeli state through its censorship of textbooks, criminalization of Nakba commemoration, and refusal to acknowledge Palestinian self-determination and sovereignty. In fact, many critical documents from the period are under lock and key, accessible only to Israelis, if at all. Defenders of Israel's version of history continuously seek to delegitimize Palestinian historians by claiming their work is too attached to the subject matter and too weak because of its reliance on oral narratives. What Israel does is to mobilize history in such a way that deviates from any intention to narrate what really happened, and instead to appropriate only those memories that serve its expansionist agenda. Erasing the Nakba is a key component of Israel's adamant refusal to allow Palestinians their internationally recognized right of return. Many mainstream history books portray the Nakba as a, quote, war between two equal sides and either justify or ignore the massacres and displacement that accompanied the founding of the Israeli state. This argument on its own should give readers pause. No massacre, no displacement of an entire people should ever be justified, regardless of the context under which it occurred. Yet, even in following this skewed rationale, the argument falls flat. There were not two warring sides. There was an occupying foreign power and an indigenous population defending itself. There were two sides only insofar as there was an oppressor, a colonizing army, and an oppressed, a native population defending their homes, their families, and their land. Not only were the Zionist militias better armed, but in the early 1940s, they also received tactical and military training from British troops. Thus, the absurdity of the Zionists saying that Palestine was, quote, a land without a people for a people without a land. Every Zionist knew that the main obstacle to founding their state was that the land they wanted for themselves was already inhabited. Arab Palestine was a flourishing society with a long-standing history and culture. There were more than 1,000 villages, thriving towns, abundant citrus and olive groves, irrigation systems, crafts, and textiles. Zionists had to obliterate all traces of this society if they were to build a new one. As the Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Dayan admitted in a speech to Israeli students in 1969, quote, "We came here to a country that was populated by Arabs, and here we are building a Hebrew, Jewish state. Instead of Arab villages, Jewish villages were established. You do not even know the names of these villages, and I do not blame you, because these geography books no longer exist. Not only the books, but all the villages do not exist. Nahalal was established in place of Mahalal, Gavat in place of Jibta, Sarid in place of Hanifas, and Kafr Yehoshua in place of Tel Shamam. There is not a single Jewish settlement not established in the place of a former Arab village." Unquote. The Palestinian Nakba is not only the compilation of the massacres of 1948 and the subsequent establishment of an Israeli state. It also comprises the population of Palestine's land, the erasure of its people, and the physical and cultural attempt to destroy its history and identity. In this sense, the Nakba is reminiscent of the United States' dispossession and erasure of indigenous Americans from the colonization of, quote, New England to the Trail of Tears and until today. Comment, I'm really glad that they made that comparison because that is how I thought of it from day one myself. Continuing. The Palestinian Nakba is neither a distant occurrence nor a completed history, and treating it as such only reproduces the Israeli contention that Palestine and Palestinians are romanticized representations of the past. Comment, I mean, that's just a psychotic, reality-denying, history-denying perspective. Continuing. The Nakba is not situated fully in the past, nor is it fully in the present. It transcends the notion of linear, progressive, and positivist history. It is a continuous and complex struggle against occupation, against apartheid, against erasure. It is the daily, physical, and abstract dispossession of land, identity, culture, and history. It is not ended, and for precisely this reason, the Israeli state has sought to penalize the remembrance of the Nakba. In 2011, Israel introduced the Nakba law, which authorized the state to withhold funding from any public institution that mourns or commemorates the Nakba. The looming threat of yet another mass expulsion of Palestinians from their homeland is ever present, especially today. The Nakba is just as present and significant as it was in 1948. Treating it otherwise is to succumb to Israel's fabricated narrative of a long-forgotten past from which it has progressed. Naming and remembering the Nakba is the most basic precondition for building a movement that can effectively resist the racism and erasure at the heart of Israel's settler colonist project. Equally important as confronting the Nakba is coming to terms with the historical developments that led to the crisis of 1948. Foremost among these are the emergence of Zionism and the Zionist movement, the basic principles of which have given the Israeli state an enduring ideological justification for its colonization of Palestine. What is Zionism? On July 19, 2018, the Israeli Knesset approved the Basic Law. Israel as the nation-state of the Jewish people, backed by the far-right government of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The so-called basic laws in Israel serve as the country's constitution and have never been overturned by the Supreme Court. The 2018 law enshrines at least three important tenets of Zionism. First, that the, quote, right to exercise national self-determination in the State of Israel is unique to the Jewish people, unquote. In other words, that the right to self-determination does not apply to Palestinians. Second, that the state language is officially Hebrew, downgrading Arabic to a language with, quote, special status. Third, quote, the state views the development of Jewish settlement as a national value and will act to encourage and promote its establishment and consolidation, unquote. Israeli Marxist and anti-Zionist Moshe Machover described these laws in this way, quote, very simply, it is about legitimation. It attempts to legitimize the Zionist state not as the political expression of its own citizens, or even that of its Hebrew majority, but as the nation-state of a fictitious, worldwide Jewish, quote, nation. It implies that the nation-state of Jews anywhere is not determined by their place of birth, or long residence or citizenship, or personal choice, but willy-nilly is the Zionist state, which claims to represent all Jews and act on their behalf, whether they like it or not, unquote. We need to look honestly at the history of Zionism, a movement that has allied itself in every case, and at every moment in its history, with the powers of world imperialism, a project that has built its very existence on the colonization of other people, the Palestinian people, on the obliteration of their history, their culture, and their land. Vladimir Jabotinsky, one of the founding fathers of the Zionist movement, wrote in 1923, quote, Zionism is a colonizing adventure, and therefore it stands or falls by the question of armed force. It is important to build, it is important to speak Hebrew, but unfortunately, it is even more important to be able to shoot, or else I am through playing at colonization, unquote. In recent years, we have seen a more robust Jabotinsky defense of Israeli expansion and the abandoning of pretense to being a democratic state. The 2018 Basic Law reflects this, as do the facts on the ground, the aggressive moves to destroy the Palestinian population, the murders of children by settlers, the repression against the Great March of Return, the war crimes, as well as the persistent organizing of campaigns to boycott Israel, operating alongside groups like Students for Justice in Palestine, SJP, have begun to turn a new generation of young Jews around the world, and especially in the United States, against the idea that Israel is a Jewish homeland. We have seen young Jews criticize and reject the racist birthright tours, which guarantee a free trip to Israel for any Jew in the world to enjoy their, quote, birthright, while Palestinians who have lived in exile from the land of their birth are denied the right to return. The roots of modern-day Zionism. Zionism is not a historic, quote, yearning to return to Zion, but a modern movement that was born in the last quarter of the 19th century. The development of Zionism as a political movement was entirely a product of European society in the age of imperialism, and it is impossible to understand outside of this context. Modern Jewish history begins with the French Revolution. In the wake of its revolutionary ideals of liberty, equality, and brotherhood, Jews won emancipation throughout Western Europe. The old ghetto walls were torn down. Jews gained new civil rights and were able to join professions that had been closed to them for generations. The vast majority of European Jews welcomed emancipation. They wanted to be able to assimilate and participate as equal members in society. But emancipation never reached Eastern Europe, where the majority of the world's Jewish population lived. In the Tsarist Empire, Jews lived in poverty and isolation, confined to industrially undeveloped areas in Poland and the Ukraine called the Pale of Settlement. There was no heavy industry in the Pale, so most Jews worked in small shops, or were part of the permanently unemployed. Life in the Pale was punctuated by the bloody pogroms, violent riots against Jewish communities that were stoked by government officials and local police. The Russian revolutionary Leon Trotsky described the pogroms of 1905, quote, 100 of Russia's towns and townlets were transformed into hells. A veil of smoke was drawn across the sun. Fires devoured entire streets with their houses and inhabitants. This was the old order's revenge for its humiliation, unquote. The rise of industrial capitalism across Europe did not bring with it an end to anti-Semitism. On the contrary, the system's violent economic booms and slumps created a climate in which Jews became easy scapegoats for the immiseration of the population. The 1880s saw a resurgence of anti-Semitism in Europe, both East and West. Over the next 3 decades, more than 5 million Jews left Eastern Europe. Most of these refugees went to Western Europe or to the United States. Significantly, only a few thousand chose to go to Palestine. In Western Europe, a prolonged economic crisis in the 1870s also led to a revival of anti-Semitism. Jews who had been safe and prosperous in those countries for over a generation were shocked to find themselves targets of this virulent racism. For many, it shattered their faith in the capitalist system and set them on the road for alternatives. Millions of Jews joined the rising revolutionary socialist movements. This revival of anti-Semitism also provided the context for Zionism to grow. Until the 1880s, the Zionist movement had consisted of a handful of fanatical religious sects. Jews who were enjoying the fruits of emancipation felt no need for religious utopias. For example, in 1862, Moses Hess, a Marxist-turned-Zionist, wrote a book called Rome and Jerusalem. It's now considered a Zionist classic, but at the time of its publication, most Jews, if they had heard of Hess at all, dismissed him as a crank. In its first year, the book sold only 160 copies, and the publisher asked that Hess buy back the remainder. The revival of anti-Semitism in the late 1800s was epitomized by the Dreyfus Affair, in which the French government framed and convicted a Jewish army officer for treason. The 1894 trial of Captain Alfred Dreyfus triggered an international movement against anti-Semitism, but for an Austrian journalist named Theodor Herzl, who covered the trial in France, the Dreyfus Affair meant that no matter how assimilated Jews were in society, they would never be safe until they had a state of their own. In 1896, Herzl published The State of the Jews, the manifesto for a new political Zionist movement. Herzl's political Zionism was secular and pragmatic. He argued that the Jewish state could be built only under the patronage of one of the imperialist powers. Comment, so, in other words, he wants to enlist the very imperialist powers whose societies, under their economic system, their society is scapegoating Jews during times of the built-in slumps or busts of capitalism. He wants them to build a country where they can be safe from all this. That would seem to have many problems. Continuing. Because the Jews would inevitably be a minority wherever they settled, and since they would incur the hostility of whatever indigenous population they were colonizing, they could not succeed without the big guns of a big imperialist power backing them up. In fact, Palestine was only one of several territories Herzl considered for colonization. Argentina, Uganda, Cyprus, and even a couple of states in the Midwest of the USA were discussed as possible locations for the Jewish state. But the religious faction in the Zionist movement fought hard for Palestine, and Herzl, never one to overlook the power of a symbol, agreed that the ancient Jewish, quote, homeland would give the movement more emotional power. However, the defining feature of Zionism was not the choice of Palestine, but the Zionists' willingness to ally with European imperialism to achieve their goals. Herzl rejected the most progressive ideals of the 19th century, democracy, socialism, republicanism, and instead embraced the most reactionary, monarchy, nationalism, chauvinism, and racism. Zionism identified with the imperialist powers that carved up the globe and accepted racist ideas about the, quote, civilizing virtues of colonization and the, quote, white man's burden. In The Jewish State, Herzl wrote, quote, the unthinking might, for example, imagine that this exodus would have to take its way from civilization into the desert. That is not so. It will be carried out entirely in the framework of civilization. We shall not revert to a lower stage, we shall rise to a higher one. We shall not dwell in mud huts, we shall build new and more beautiful, more modern houses, and possess them in safety. We should there form a part of a wall of defense for Europe and Asia, an outpost of civilization against barbarism. Europe would have to guarantee our existence, unquote. Israel and its supporters have long claimed that it is the only democracy in the Middle East, but democracy was not the political system that Herzl envisioned for the Jewish state. Throughout his career, Herzl was deeply impressed by the power and authority of kings. After a meeting with the German Kaiser, Herzl wrote in his diary that the Kaiser, quote, has truly imperial eyes. I have never seen such eyes. A remarkable, bold, inquisitive soul shows in them. And it is clear from his diaries that Herzl saw himself taking his place among the European rulers at the head of a Jewish state. He wrote once with typical humility, quote, on Sunday, while I sat on the platform, I saw and heard the rising of my legend. The people are sentimental. The masses do not see clearly. A light mist has begun to beat about me, which will perhaps deepen into a cloud, in the midst of which I shall walk. At least they understand that I mean well by them. I am the man of the poor. Unquote. Zionism and the Jews. If one of the defining features of Zionism was its identification with imperial power, another was the way Herzl and founders of the movement viewed the very Jews they claimed to represent. The writings of Herzl and his colleague Max Nordau are littered with descriptions of European Jews as parasites, social diseases, germs, aliens. They were frustrated and bewildered that most Jews wanted to assimilate and live in their countries of birth. To these men who worshipped power and privilege, the desperate poverty of the Jews of Eastern Europe was a sign of weakness in the Jewish character. Nordau wrote, quote, I contemplate with horror the future development of this race of assimilated Jews of Europe, which is sustained morally by no tradition, whose soul is poisoned with hostility to both its own and to strange blood, and whose self-respect is destroyed through the ever-present consciousness of a fundamental lie. This is the picture of the Jewish people at the end of the 19th century. To sum up, the majority of Jews are a race of accursed beggars. Unquote. Nordau's repulsive views flowed quite logically from Zionism's basic assumption about Jews. Zionists accepted the 19th century view that anti-Semitism, in fact all racial or ethnic animosity, was a permanent feature of human nature. For this reason, it was pointless to struggle against it. In their view, the solution for Jews was to form a state and convince the European world that Jews belonged to the class of the, quote, superior colonizers, not that of the colonized. It was a very short jump from this belief to concluding that Jews themselves were the cause of anti-Semitism. Herzl accepted the idea that Jews were an economic burden on society, that their very presence provoked violence from the rest of society. He wrote, quote, wherever the Jewish question does not exist, it is brought in together with Jewish immigrants. We are naturally drawn into those places where we are not persecuted, and our appearance there gives rise to persecution. This is the case and will inevitably be so everywhere. The unfortunate Jews are now carrying the seeds of anti-Semitism into England. They are carrying it. Interesting. They have already introduced it into America. But once Jews go to Palestine, the countries of emigration will rise to a new prosperity. Comment, which kind of seems like the focus here, doesn't it? Like getting these, people who are a blight on these societies out so that the societies in question can flourish by getting rid of them. It's a very odd starting point for somebody who's claiming to advocate for these so-called parasites. Okay, continuing. There will be an inner migration of Christian citizens into the positions relinquished by Jews. The outflow will be gradual, without any disturbance, and its very inception means the end of anti-Semitism. Once we begin to execute the plan, anti-Semitism will cease at once, and everywhere. It is the relief from the old burden under which all have suffered. Unquote. So commenting on that, that's the end of that section, that's crazy. I have never read this personally before. So the entire idea, according to that guy, Max Nordau, the whole idea was that that the Jews, just like their presence is so noxious that it makes people hate them, quote, introducing the seeds of anti-Semitism, and that if you get the Jews out, those societies will like prosper like never before. Um, anyway, I was unfamiliar with that. Continuing, Zionism and imperialism. To acquire the land for his state, Herzl was willing to beg from the table of every imperialist power, no matter how criminal. He courted them all, the German Kaiser, the Turks, the Russian Tsar, and the British Empire. In 1896, Herzl entered into negotiations with the Turkish Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, which had ruled over Palestine for more than 500 years. Herzl offered the Sultan a deal. In exchange for giving Palestine to the Jews, the Zionist movement would help soften world condemnation of Turkey for its genocidal campaign against the Armenians. He even pledged to meet with Armenian leaders to convince them to call off their resistance struggle. As it turned out, the Sultan rejected the offer. But as before I read that, let me just comment again. He even pledged to meet with Armenian leaders to convince them to call off their resistance struggle. I feel like just needs to be double underlined. That is the orientation to power of this character. Truly stunning. Continuing. As it turned out, the Sultan rejected the offer, but as historian Lenny Brenner notes, quote, "It would have occurred to no one else in the broad Jewish world to have tried to hinder or interfere with the Armenians in their struggle, nor would anyone have thought to support Turkey in any of its wars. And in the end, Zionism gained nothing by its actions. But what was demonstrated early in its history was that there were no criteria of ordinary humanism that the World Zionist Organization considered itself bound to respect." Unquote. Herzl never met a butcher he didn't like, even if they were guilty of slaughtering Jews. In 1903, he went to the Russian Tsar to see if he could convince Russia to pressure the Ottomans into handing over Palestine. In an infamous meeting, Herzl actually sat down with Count von Plehve, a man credited with helping to organize some of the most violent pogroms in the Tsarist Empire in the early 19th century. Herzl argued with Plehve that Zionism was the solution to Russia's, quote, Jewish problem, namely the enormous number of Jews who were flooding into revolutionary organizations. That's just... I'm sorry, I'm trying to read this straight. This is wild stuff. Continuing. Herzl later recalled that he told von Plehve, "Help me reach land sooner, and the revolt will end, and so will the defection to the socialists." Unquote. Herzl then met with a member of the Russian Social Revolutionary Party, Chaim Jitlovsky, in a bid to persuade him to accept his plan for Palestine. Jitlovsky rejected Herzl's proposal, offering instead a response that epitomizes the revolutionary socialist position on Zionism. Quote, "We Jewish revolutionaries, even the most national among us, are not Zionists and do not believe that Zionism is able to resolve our problem. The situation of Zionism is already dubious enough by the very fact of its standing aloof from the revolution. Its situation in Jewish life would become impossible if it could be shown that it undertakes positive steps to damage the Jewish revolutionary struggle." Unquote. Herzl's meeting with von Plehve turned out to be a tactical disaster, alienating the very Russian Jews he was trying to recruit to the movement. Chaim Weizmann, president of the World Zionist Organization, later wrote, quote, "In general, West European Jewry thinks that the majority of East European Jewish youth belongs to the Zionist camp. Unfortunately, the contrary is true. The lion's share of the youth is anti-Zionist, not from an assimilationist point of view as in West Europe, but rather as a result of their revolutionary mood. It is impossible to describe how many became the victims of police oppression because of membership in the Jewish social democracy. They are sent to jail and left to rot in Siberia. 5,000 are under state surveillance. And I am not speaking only of the youth of the proletariat. Almost the entire Jewish student body stands firmly behind the revolutionary camp, and all this is accomplished by a distaste for Jewish nationalism which borders on self-hatred." Unquote. That says you, I guess. Herzl's movement held its first Congress in Basel, Switzerland in 1897. After that, waves of Zionist pioneers started migrating into Palestine. Zionist settler colonialism did not come to exploit the Arabs, but instead sought to completely replace them. The goal was to create an exclusively Jewish state with a Jewish majority. In order to achieve this, Zionists had to destroy the Palestinian economy, steal the land, drive the Arabs out of the labor market, and erase the very memory that they'd ever been there. This meant carrying out a war on a number of fronts, reflected in the three slogans of the pioneer Zionists: conquest of land, conquest of labor, and produce of the land. By conquest of land, they meant to buy and steal as much Arab land as possible. By conquest of labor, to force Jewish landowners to employ Jewish-only labor and organize Jewish-only trade unions to dominate the labor market. And by produce of the land, to boycott and physically harass Palestinians' farms and businesses to drive them out. Quick comment there, that really reminds me a lot of the United States. Continuing. The Iron Wall of English Bayonets. The First World War and the Russian Revolution caused the collapse of Herzl's three beloved patrons, the Ottoman Empire, German Kaiser, and Russian Tsar. Though the Zionists played all sides covertly during the war, the more far-sighted leaders anticipated that Britain would emerge from the war as the dominant imperialist power. When the war ended, Palestine became a British colony, and the Zionists found they shared many interests with their new colonial masters. In 1917, Britain issued the Balfour Declaration, the first official recognition of the Zionist settlements in Palestine. Under the British Mandate government, British privileged the small Jewish population over the Palestinians. In 1917, there were 56,000 Jews in Palestine and 644,000 Palestinians. Nonetheless, Britain gave 90% of concessions for projects like building roads and power plants to Jewish capitalists, and by 1935, Zionists owned 872 out of the 1,212 industrial firms in Palestine. The British ruling class, which was rabidly anti-Semitic, had its own reasons for this support. Out of the First World War, Arab nationalism had emerged as a major threat to British domination of the Middle East, and Britain hoped that Zionists could be a useful force for policing the Arabs. But Winston Churchill gave another reason for supporting Zionism: defeat of the left-wing, quote, international Jews. In an astoundingly anti-Semitic article titled Zionism versus Bolshevism, Churchill wrote, quote, "From the days of Spartacus to those of Karl Marx and down to Trotsky in Russia, Bela Kun, Hungary, Rosa Luxemburg, Germany, and Emma Goldman, United States. I see where this is going. This worldwide conspiracy for the overthrow of civilization and for the reconstitution of society on the basis of arrested development, of envious malevolence, and impossible equality has been steadily growing. It becomes, therefore, especially important to foster and develop any strongly marked Jewish movement which leads directly away from these fatal associations. And it is here that Zionism has such a deep significance for the whole world at the present time. Should there be created in our own lifetime by the banks of the Jordan a Jewish state under the protection of the British Crown, which might comprise 3 or 4 millions of Jews, an event would have occurred in the history of the world which would, from every point of view, be beneficial and would be especially in harmony with the truest interests of the British Empire." Unquote. Comment. So, in other words, get all these socialist Jews who are wrecking our, quote, civilization out of here. Okay, so that's where this is coming from. Continuing. In 1936, the Palestinians began the Great Arab Revolt against British and Zionist colonization. The revolt lasted 3 years and was only defeated by savage British repression, drawing in at some points half the British military. Zionists organized armed militias, called the Haganah, and paramilitary units, which played an important supporting role in crushing the revolt. They also took advantage of the Palestinian general strike to gain control of new sectors of the economy, replacing more Palestinian owners and workers with Jews. The British military repression was so severe that it left the Palestinian population demoralized and exhausted for many years. This cleared the field for the Zionists to focus on the last remaining obstacle to a Jewish state, the British Mandate itself. After all, the Zionists were colonizers and had no intention of remaining subjects in someone else's colony. In 1945, they declared war on the British, with the intention of seizing full control over the Mandate territories. In 1947, the United Nations imposed its criminal partition of Palestine, which granted the majority of the land to the minority of Jewish settlers. For the Zionists, this was a green light to begin the ethnic cleansing of the Nakba. I would not accept Arabs in my trade union. Many of the leaders, like Herzl, were extremely hostile to socialism. But Marxism was enormously influential in the Jewish communities of Eastern Europe. If Zionism was going to build in that atmosphere, it had to make some accommodation. Ber Borochov was the father of the movement called Proletarian Zionism, which, as its name implies, tried to synthesize Marxism and Jewish nationalism. Borochov's supposedly Marxist analysis was that, because the Jewish proletariat of Eastern Europe worked in economically marginal jobs, they had no social power as workers. Therefore, they were powerless to effect change in Russia. Thus, Jewish workers needed to go build their own nation, where they could become a, quote, real proletariat, organized in the real centers of production. Only then could they make a socialist revolution. In the meantime, they might have to make some alliances, temporarily, of course, with Jewish capitalists. In reality, this was just giving a pseudo-Marxist gloss to the same pessimistic message that Zionism is all about. You can't fight here at home against oppression. You must organize to go to Palestine and build the state. The organized Borochov founded, the Workers of Zion, actually played a reactionary role in the Russian labor movement. Oh, wow, gee. Zionists in the unions argued against any and all united action with non-Jewish workers, which in effect put them in the position of strikebreakers. Here was a party claiming to represent Jewish workers that opposed the struggles of Jewish workers. In 1901, members of the Bund, the Jewish revolutionary organization that was bitterly hostile to Zionism, organized to drive the Zionists out of their unions. In Palestine, the racist socialist Zionists built organizations that were invaluable to the process of colonization. They founded the Histadrut, the Jewish-only trade union federation, which organized the exclusion of Arab workers from the job market. They started the kibbutzim, the agricultural collectives that built exclusively Jewish settlements on Palestinian land and defended those settlements with arms. The reality of, quote, Zionist Marxism is that it had to stretch Marxism beyond all recognition to justify its colonial project. David Hakohen, a Labor Party leader, recalled the ideological difficulties in 1969. Quote, I had to fight my friends on the issue of Jewish socialism, to defend the fact that I would not accept Arabs in my trade union, the Histadrut, to defend preaching to housewives that they not buy at Arab stores, to defend the fact that we stood guard at orchards to prevent Arab workers from getting jobs there, to pour kerosene on Arab tomatoes, to attack Jewish housewives in the markets and smash the Arab eggs they had bought, unquote. The iron wall of Jewish bayonets. If the Jewish-only trade unions and kibbutzim were the organizations of the Zionist, quote, left, then revisionism, under the leadership of Vladimir Jabotinsky, formed the right wing of the movement. Jabotinsky called his faction revisionism because it revised what he saw as the weaknesses of the movement, its willingness to negotiate with British imperialism, to accept concessions on key questions like immigration and land seizure. In particular, Jabotinsky was quite open and blunt about how Zionists should deal with, quote, the Arab question. Quote, thus we conclude that we cannot promise anything to the Arabs of the land of Israel or the Arab countries. Their voluntary agreement is out of the question. Hence, those who hold that an agreement with the natives is an essential condition for Zionism can now say no and depart from Zionism. Zionist colonization, even the most restricted, must either be terminated or carried out in defiance of the will of the native population. This colonization can, therefore, continue and develop only under the protection of a force independent of the local population, an iron wall which the native population cannot break through. This is, in toto, our policy towards the Arabs. To formulate it any other way would only be hypocrisy." Unquote. Just commenting, I don't know how people can write things like this. Okay, going on. Revisionists were openly sympathetic to fascism. Yeah, sounds about right. Batar, the revisionist youth movement, admired Mussolini. They wore brown shirts and did the fascist salute. The revisionist newspaper carried a regular column called From the Notebook of a Fascist, and on one occasion when Jabotinsky came to Palestine, the newspaper ran a column titled On the Arrival of Our Duce. In 1933, a columnist wrote, "Social Democrats of all stripes believe that Hitler's movement is an empty shell, but we believe that there is both a shell and a kernel. The anti-Semitic shell is to be discarded, but not the anti-Marxist kernel." Unquote. Comment, that is truly stunning. Continuing. The labor Zionists tried at times to distance themselves from the actions of the extremist paramilitaries. But when the time came for united action, they showed that their squabbles were all in the family. As Jabotinsky put it, quote, "Force must play its role, with strength and without indulgence. In this, there are no meaningful differences between our militarists and our vegetarians. One prefers an iron wall of Jewish bayonets, the other an iron wall of English bayonets." Unquote. It was Jabotinsky who founded the Haganah and the revisionists who formed the paramilitary organizations, the Irgun, as well as the fascist Stern Gang. In 1945, the revisionists and the labor Zionists united to form the resistance movement to wage war against the British and then the Palestinians. The Irgun and the Stern Gang were responsible for the infamous massacre in the village of Deir Yassin in 1948. At least until the 1980s, veterans of the Irgun still returned to Deir Yassin to commemorate their, quote, heroism. Zionism and the Holocaust. Zionism's most powerful claim to legitimacy is that the State of Israel is necessary to prevent another Holocaust. The legacy of the Holocaust is invoked to justify every atrocity committed by Israel, but it is precisely the record of how the Jewish Agency, the Zionist leadership governing Jewish settlements in Palestine before the establishment of Israel in 1948, responded to the Holocaust that provides the most damning evidence against Zionism. To the leaders of the Jewish Agency, the rise of fascism had a definite upside. Menahem Usishkin told a Zionist executive meeting, quote, "There is something positive in their tragedy, and that is that Hitler oppressed them as a race and not as a religion. Had he done the latter, half the Jews in Germany would simply have converted to Christianity." Unquote. Stunning. In 1934, labor Zionist Moshe Belenson went to Germany and reported back to the Labor Party, quote, "The streets are paved with more money than we have ever dreamed of in the history of our Zionist enterprise. Here is an opportunity to build and flourish like none we have ever had or ever will have." Unquote. Specifically, the opportunity he referred to meant the potential for thousands of new immigrants and their assets to come flooding into Palestine. However, Zionist officials were quite blunt in stating that they didn't want all the refugees from Hitler's Holocaust. They didn't want the burden of absorbing millions of impoverished, sick refugees who had no ideological passion for Palestine. The agency only wanted young, healthy Jews who could come over to work and fight and build the state. As Israeli historian Tom Segev writes, quote, "Urban life was, in the Zionist leaders' eyes, a symptom of social and moral degeneration. Returning to the land would give birth to the, quote, new man they hoped to create in Palestine. In parceling out the immigration certificates, they therefore gave preference to those who could play a role in their program for building the country. They preferred healthy young Zionists." Unquote. The German Immigrants Association in Palestine actually complained in 1934 that the Zionist organizations in Berlin weren't being selective enough about whom they were sending. Its letter of complaint stated in part, quote, "The human material coming from Germany is getting worse and worse." Unquote. It's real humanitarians here. It even returned some of the refugees to Germany who they felt would be too much of a burden. This is horrible. The rescue committee, it's like, what the fuck? How did people wind up involved in this? Continuing. The Rescue Committee of the Jewish Agency wrote a private memorandum in 1943 about the prospects for their work. At the time this was written, it still could have been possible to save millions of Jews from Hitler's final solution, but they didn't even try. Quote, "Whom to save? Should we help everyone in need without regard to the quality of the people? Should we not give this activity a Zionist national character and try foremost to save those who can be of use to the land of Israel and to Jewry? I understand that it seems cruel to put the question in this form, but unfortunately we must state that if we are able to save only 10,000 people from among the 50,000 who can contribute to build the country, as against saving 1,000,000 Jews who will be a burden, or at best an apathetic element, we must restrain ourselves and save the 10,000 that can be saved from among the 50,000, despite the accusations and pleas of 1,000,000, unquote. Yeah, that might be considered cruel. Was this position unethical? To paraphrase Jabotinsky, this was their ethic. There was no other ethic. To the Zionists, the needs of the Jewish state came first, second, and last. The refugees who did make it to Palestine were treated with contempt by the press and public. They were seen as passive victims whose families perished because they failed to stand up for themselves. One German immigrant wrote to the German language press, quote, "We have seen Germany's nationalism gone mad, and we trembled. We are on the road to a similar situation here," unquote. The bottom line was that the Jewish Agency in Palestine had many opportunities to rescue tens of thousands of Jews and perhaps more, but they sabotaged proposal after proposal, choosing to spend their money on land settlements instead of rescue. David Ben-Gurion, the first Prime Minister of Israel, said, quote, "It is the job of Zionism not to save the remnant of Israel in Europe, but rather to save the land of Israel for the Jewish people and the Yishuv," unquote. Chaim Weizmann, the first president of Israel, was even more blunt, quote, "The hopes of Europe's 6 million Jews are centered on emigration. I was asked, can you bring 6 million Jews to Palestine? I replied, no. From the depths of the tragedy, I want to save young people for Palestine. The old ones will pass. They will bear their fate, or they will not. They are dust, economic and moral dust in a cruel world. Only the branch of the young shall survive. They have to accept it," unquote. In the 1950s, a dramatic court case in Israel revealed that the Zionists had acted with criminal neglect, if not outright complicity, in the destruction of Hungarian Jewry. Evidence produced at the trial showed that Rudolf Kastner, a top official in the Israeli Labor Party, and the person in charge of the rescue committee in Hungary during the war, had actively collaborated with the Nazis. Kastner negotiated with Nazi official Adolf Eichmann, one of the architects of the Holocaust, to get approval for a VIP train of 1,685 Hungarian Jews to leave Hungary safely. Kastner personally selected the passengers for the train, which included several hundred people from his hometown and a dozen members of his family. He worked with SS officer Kurt Becker to make the financial arrangements. In exchange for the safe passage of the train, Kastner agreed not to warn the Jews of Hungary, whose rescue was in his hands, about Hitler's plans for their extermination, and not to take any action to protect them. Worse, he helped to deceive Hungarian Jews, convincing them that they were simply being relocated. After the war, Kastner testified at the Nuremberg trials on Becker's behalf, which resulted in Becker, murderer of 500,000 Hungarian Jews, going free. Most damning of all, it became clear that Kastner had not acted alone, but that his plan for the VIP train had the support of the highest leaders of the Jewish Agency. Toward the end of the war, a staunch anti-Zionist, Rabbi Dov Michael Weissmandel, met with high-level Nazi officials to make a desperate deal. The Nazis knew they were losing the war and needed cash. They told Weissmandel that the remaining Jews could buy their freedom for a large sum of money. The Nazis gave Weissmandel a deadline to come up with that money. Weiss-Mandel flooded the Zionist organizations with his pleas, but they chose to do nothing. The deadline passed. In an agonizing letter to the Jewish Agency, Weiss-Mandel wrote, quote, "Why have you done nothing until now? Who is guilty of this frightful negligence? Are you not guilty, our Jewish brothers? You who have the greatest good fortune in the world, liberty? 12,000 Jews, men, women, and children, old men, infants, healthy and sick ones, are to be suffocated daily. Their destroyed hearts cry out for you to help as they bewail your cruelty." Unquote. The Nazis murdered the Jewish revolutionary left in Europe. They wiped out its best leaders and organizations. It was these socialists and communists who helped to organize the underground resistance to fascism in countries across Europe, who fought bravely to defend the Warsaw Ghetto against the Nazi assault. With the destruction of these fighters went the memory of what they had accomplished and stood for. It is vital to start with this fact because Zionism has profited enormously from our historical amnesia. The destruction of the strong anti-Zionist tradition among European Jews has meant that Zionism has been able to claim that it represents the unified voice of Jews throughout the world. Therefore, anyone who opposes them is an anti-Semite. We don't learn that, up until the Second World War, vast numbers of Jews supported the parties of revolutionary socialism, a tradition that opposed Zionism. In 1905, the anti-Zionist Bund, the Revolutionary Organization of Jewish Workers, condemned Zionism both for its solution to anti-Semitism and for its colonization of Arabs. In 1910, the Jewish socialist Karl Kautsky wrote, "It is labor that gives people a right to the land in which it lives. Thus Judaism can advance no claim on Palestine. On the basis of the right of labor and of democratic self-determination, today Palestine does not belong to the Jews of Vienna, London, or New York, who claim it for Judaism, but to the Arabs of the same country, the great majority of the population." It is not hard to see why many Jews were hostile to Zionism. Zionism called for a retreat from the struggle against anti-Semitism. But the socialist movement argued that the fight against anti-Semitism was central to the revolutionary struggle against capitalism. Thus, on one side stood the revolutionaries who organized Jews and non-Jews together to fight the pogroms, lead strikes, and overthrow the Tsarist regime that perpetuated Jewish oppression. On the other side stood the Zionists, who collaborated with the Tsar and his butchers, stood aside from the struggles for self-defense, and sabotaged work in the unions. It was the revolutionary workers' movement, not Zionism, that offered a genuine hope for liberation for European Jews. Lenin and the Bolsheviks took an uncompromising position against anti-Semitism, seeing it as a source of weakness in the Russian working class. Lenin argued that socialists must be the tribune of the oppressed, willing to fight every instance of anti-Semitism, regardless of what class of Jews were affected. After the Russian Revolution of 1917, the Bolsheviks abolished all racist laws against Jews and severely punished incidents of anti-Semitism. During the Civil War, the imperialist-backed White Army in the Ukraine murdered as many as 60,000 Jews, while the Bolshevik Red Army became the protector of the Jewish communities in Poland and the Ukraine. Today, the inherent racism and violence of the Zionist project is very much alive today. The number of right-wing governments and parties closely allied with Israel today is astounding, from Jair Bolsonaro's neo-fascist government in Brazil to Narendra Modi's ethno-nationalist regime in India. It is a fact that Israel is at the forefront of the international far right, forming alliances with European political figures who themselves at times invoke anti-Semitic tropes or sit silently as virulent racist mobs rally in their streets. Italy's Matteo Salvini and Hungary's Viktor Orban are just two examples. Israel has even provided arms to neo-Nazi militias in Ukraine. Zionism is no longer affiliated with Judaism alone. In fact, today groups like Christians United for Israel, an organization with more than 5 million members, represent the largest drivers of U.S. support for Israel. Just as almost a century ago, Zionist leaders remain largely silent in the face of attacks against Jews by the allies of Zionism. On August 14, 2019, a prison guard working for U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, drove a truck through a crowd of Jewish protesters, organized by Never Again, calling for an end to the unlawful detention of immigrant children in ICE concentration camps on the U.S.-Mexico border. In fact, ICE agents are trained in Israel through joint U.S.-funded workshops and conferences. Additionally, the surveillance technology used to capture and detain immigrants and refugees crossing the U.S.-Mexico border is Israeli, tried and tested on Palestinians under occupation. We should not underestimate the influence of xenophobia and Islamophobia in the growing alliance between Israel and the international far right. The rampant Islamophobia funneled into our society, the discourse about the good and the bad Muslim. These concepts are meant to further vilify Muslims and Arabs at large and paint them as regressive, irrational, and violent. In turn, these propagandistic images are used by Israel to justify its repression, torture, and murder of Palestinians on a daily basis, both in Palestine and abroad. These tactics are shared by ICE, which conjures images of bad immigrants to justify the deportation of hundreds of thousands of immigrants and refugees. For decades, segments of the far right in the U.S. have cozied up to Israel under the cover of the bipartisan support that Israel relies on. This relationship has been exposed under the Trump administration, which has not only emboldened white supremacist groups, but also offered them a platform to publicly vocalize their ideology. With little pushback from other segments of the U.S. establishment, these groups, including Act for America, Identity Europa, and the KKK, flaunt their racist rhetoric, which quickly incites very real violence against black and brown communities across the United States. Israel does more than legitimize these groups. It acts as an inspiration and example of the ethno-nationalist state to which they aspire. White nationalist Richard Spencer made this clear when he lauded Israel as the, quote, most important ethno-state, the one I turn to for guidance, unquote. White supremacy, with its inherently racist and violent nature, is based on the aspiration to cleanse the United States of its non-white population. That is, Muslims, Jews, black, brown, and LGBTQ people, in the same way that Israel's project is to cleanse all those who stand in the way of its expansionist agenda. The hideous policies of the current Israeli regime and its close alliance with the U.S. establishment must be seen in the context of a long history of the occupation and colonization of Palestine. Indeed, it is a reminder that the Nakba is not a thing of the past. Its impact is felt by every single Palestinian, and its memory shields against the systematic attempt to whitewash the violence and bloodshed that characterized Israel's birth 70 years ago and sustains its apartheid regime today. We should take pride in the record of the socialist movement and its principled opposition to anti-Semitism and all oppression. Today, those same principles require us to side wholly with Palestinians in their struggle against settler colonial Israel. Next to the treacherous, counter-revolutionary record of Zionism, we must counterpose the best traditions of the workers' movement of struggle and solidarity. So, that is the end of the audiobook. That is Roots of the Nakba, Zionist Settler Colonialism by Sumaya Awad and Annie Levin. Again, I encourage everyone to go out and pick up a copy of this book. It contains at least 9 other articles of this type. I will do 1 or 2 more of these on the channel. And for now, I'm going to wrap it up. Thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. Again, if you like this video, please click like and subscribe. Consider leaving a comment, and anywhere that you can share this video is much appreciated. Thanks for listening, and we will catch you in the next one.